Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Debra Newman Kamin of the Am Yisrael congregation in the Chicago area. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Our parsha is Shelach. It is a dramatic parsha in which Moses sends 12 spies to tour the land of Canaan. 40 days later, they return carrying impressive fruit. They report that the land is bountiful, but 10 of them warn that the inhabitants of the land are giants and warriors. The people weep that they rather return to Egypt than fight these giants. God decrees that Israel's entry into the land shall be delayed for another 40 years. The group of remorseful Jews who stormed the land find defeat. More in this parsha, laws of the menachot, meal, wine, and oil offerings. A man violates the Shabbat and is put to death, also in this parsha. The first pasuk says, or the first two psukim, וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, שלח לך אנשים ויתורו את ארץ כנען אשר אני נותן לבני ישראל, איש אחד למטה אבותיו תשלחו כל נשיא בהם. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send out for yourself men who will scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. You shall send one man each for his father's tribe. Each one shall be a chieftain of their midst, in their midst. So, Rabbi, the Torah tells us that when the spies told their story, the entire community, this is what the Torah says, the entire community raised their voices and shouted, and the people wept on that night. Wouldn't you weep?
Well, what's interesting about the Parsha to me is that it actually gives us a lot of psychological insight into the characters, even God, which we can talk about in a moment. The Torah tells us a lot in other places, very briefly about people's feelings. They laugh, well, I don't say they laugh, they cry, they're angry, they love. But this gives us a whole different level of sort of psychological insight. So, of course, I think that the idea that the people would weep, I mean, here they've been traveling, they're freed, they're scared. And, of course, Maimonides tells us, the Rambam tells us, that it would be unusual to expect that these people that were slaves in no way would be able to take on fighting for the land that God promised them. And so that generation has to die out in the desert until you have a free generation that can rise up and fight.
So we are in agreement that this is natural human behavior.
I think it is natural human behavior, but sort of, I hate to juxtapose everything against modern Israeli politics. But, but it's hard to read this parsha, where they say, the land is beautiful, but it's too much for us, and read the newspaper and sort of ask the same question. But sort of what strikes me is the stories about Holocaust survivors, like arriving in Israel, getting off the boat, being given a gun and sent off to fight in the War of Independence. So while this is actually, I think, very natural that people would react this way, it's interesting to sort of juxtapose it against stories of people that were, enslaved, were brutalized, their families were massacred, and still had the ability to fight for the land of Israel.
The difference, though, is that these people did see God make miracles on the road to the land of Canaan.
That's sort of exactly but they had a lot more information than we have as human beings. What interests me, though, is what the spies say when they come back and they say, we saw giants there. Like, yes, the land is beautiful, but we saw giants there. If you look in chapter 13, the end of chapter 13, and it said, they were giants, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. That's a fascinating psychological insight about how they saw themselves. They didn't say the land wasn't beautiful. They didn't say the land wasn't a land of milk and honey. They saw that these people were, they call them giants. But what's interesting is that the Torah says that they saw themselves as grasshoppers. It's interesting. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Katz basically asked the question, what do you care? Like, why would you care what other people think of you? But it's an interesting psychological insight that they felt themselves to be much less than the people that they were going to have to fight. And this is a slave mentality. I mean, they had been treated as less than. And I suppose that the Torah, shows us that all of God's miracles doesn't counteract the kind of psychological damage that comes from being enslaved.
And talking about psychology and about our tendency to go back to our old habits, later when the people of Israel consult with one another, they say, and I quote from the Torah, "Vayomru ish el achiv nitna rosh v'nashuva mitzrayma." They said to each other, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." And Rashi makes an interesting comment. He says that according to some of the sages, this term, Nashuva Mitzrayim Nitna Rosh, the head they are talking about, the Rosh, refers to idolatry.
That's fascinating.
So not only they have slave mentality, they also tend to go back and think about their former idols.
Right. Well, look, we know we're not that far out from the golden calf incident. Even after everything they've seen God do for them, they need that concrete idol. It's interesting because the other question about this parsha is why is this an unforgivable sin?
Yeah, you promised earlier to talk about the psychology of God as well.
The psychology of God, far be it from me to, psychoanalyze God, but, God has forgiven them idolatry. God forgives the golden calf. People get punished, but on the whole, God forgives them. And so it's an interesting question to ask, why is this unforgivable? Is it that just this is the straw that broke the camel's back? This is just, one after another, and God's finally had it. But the verse in the Torah talks about God's punishment, and he says to them that they're going to be punished for the land that you rejected. And I question whether, God, I can understand idolatry, right? Idolatry is misplaced longing for God. You're wrong-headed. You're not supposed to make idols. You're told you're not supposed to make idols. But there's still this desire on the part of the people to have a relationship, a misguided relationship, but a relationship. Mm-hmm. But rejecting the land that God promised, that's going too far. If you've ever given somebody a gift that they've, thrown back at you, God seems to be taking this even more personally than anything that the children of Israel have done up till now. It's as if, rejecting the land is more than God can bear. And so, as we know, this generation has to die out until there's a generation that and God says, the children that you were not willing to, bring into the land, these are the very children that will inherit the land. So it's also sort of this sense of, in Judaism, we're sort of obsessed with Lador Vador, that you're not doing right by the next generation, God says, so you got to go, but I will do right by the next generation, and they'll be the ones that I bring into the land. So it's again, it's an interesting and powerful question. I almost feel like God is saying, you can reject me, I can handle it, but you can't reject the land of Israel.
Right, and you have to wonder about him, though. Did he not understand that the first generation of slaves is not mature enough, is not ready to enter the land?
I think you could make an argument that from the beginning of Bereshit all the way through the Torah, God is absolutely surprised and unprepared for what human beings really are. From the Garden of Eden, that God creates human beings, and on, the first day of creation, they sin, the one thing he asked them not to do. There's an interesting, when God is giving the Ten Commandments, he tells Moses to build up barriers lest the people run and what do? They run away. They don't run towards God, they run away. Like over and over, I think God is really surprised and disappointed. You'd think that a God that we assume is all-knowing would understand this about human beings, but I think God is learning, as much as the Torah is us learning about God, I think one could make the very strong argument that the Torah is also about God learning about us. And actually not giving up on us in spite of our constantly being very disappointing subjects.
That's an important lesson for us who also tend to be disappointed and blindsided by things that people often do.
Right. So it's a whole psychological study, I guess, about how we see ourselves, our own insecurities of feeling as grasshoppers, and maybe not giving up on human beings and not giving up on God. It's a lot you could say from this parsha.
Rabbi, thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.